Hello and welcome to 12th week together, and today we're going to talk about Japan from 800 to 1400. Now, your chapter focuses a little bit on Japan, but it also covers some things about China and Korea and other places. So we're going to focus just on Japan. It's going to be relatively short because there's a lot of information that's kind of covered in your chapters as well, but I'm going to reinforce some points that we find throughout the chapter. We're going to start off, of course, with terms. Heian is a city in central Honshu, Japan, which serves as the legal capital, or the de jure capital, of the country from the 8th century to about the 19th century, mid-19th century. It's also known as Kyoto, and it's actually a, well, you'll read in the chapter, it's actually a reference to a peaceful kingdom, a peaceful capital, that is to differentiate from its earlier capitals, incarnations, that were actually kind of war camp capitals. Hiragana and katakana, these are Japanese phonetic scripts. Hiragana is for Japanese words and katakana is for borrow words. Anything from a Chinese word to a Korean word or even a European word such as something from English like McDonald's or anything from French, say croissant or something like that. These were created between the 9th and 11th centuries and emerge as a kind of counter to the way that Chinese characters are created. Chinese characters are represent ideas or abstract meanings, and often they can become lost or morphed or changed over time. Whereas the phonetic script is typically a consonant-vowel combination, although sometimes consonant-consonant combinations are possible too. Bakufu literally means a tent government, and it is a military government that emerges during the Kamakura shogunate, and it is to differentiate from the Heian government. This is a much more practical or pragmatic government that is based less on philosophy and more on practical experience, as well as some military rules. The Kamakura shogunate is named so after a city in south-central Honshu, Japan, which served as the real capital or the de facto capital from the 12th century to the 14th century. Although the capital does not move, it technically remains Kyoto or Heian. The real decisions are actually made in Kamakura between the 12th and 14th centuries. Now, previously, we had covered a little bit about Japanese society, but I wanted to touch on this a little bit more closely because the last time it was very topical, very shallow, so we're going to look at it a little bit more closely. Now, the new capital is moved to Heian in Kyoto about the end of the 8th century, give or take a couple of years. And this is where it begins to diverge from Chinese emulation. Up until this point, Japan had been trying to craft itself as a kind of mini China, emulating the very successful Tang dynasty. The shift to this new capital also coincides with a kind of break in diplomatic and even trade relationships with the mainland Chinese, although there is still a little bit of this emulation that goes on even as late as the 10th century, particularly when it comes to fashion and colors and patterns and that sort of thing in clothing. You can imagine that after 200 years of not really interacting with each other, that the Japanese sense of what Chinese fashion is in vogue would be radically different from the reality. It'd be kind of like people today dressing up as if they were from the 18th century, like they were going to fight in the 7 Years' War or something like that. The same capital, Heian would remain the same capital, or Kyoto would remain the same capital for the next 1,000 years. So it does have a long history and a very deep cultural significance to the Japanese people. It is now basically kind of a a museum city in certain parts, but it's also still a very much a living city of about 1.5 million people. Still, you can see some of the older Capitol buildings, some of the older temples, and particularly some of the older Buddhist monasteries that were used as government houses for many years during the Heian period. So this divergence from Chinese culture also is part of the reason why we talked a little bit about that Japanese phonetic script, because that's when this emerges. And it allows for a much more rapid literacy rate, and especially the promulgation of truly Japanese sense of art and expression. You get the new Japanese music begins to emerge, Japanese storytelling, particularly the itinerant bards or itinerant storytellers who move around Japan. You also get new Japanese styles of art, literature, and of course fashion. I would like to draw your attention to the woman here on the right, or the doll here on the right, and notice her extremely long hair. Well, this is a sign of her nobility. We can see this when you watch a clip of the Tale of Genji. You see this impossibly long hair. And what does this signify? Well, it signifies a new, more detached elite. But I'm going to get to that in just a little bit here. The majority of the records that we have from this period, and there are a lot of records from this period, are from the super elite. Now, most of the documents of state are still kept in Chinese characters with a Japanese pronunciation and often filling in for Japanese words, but that's on its way out. And by the time we get to the end of the Heian period, those records are being written in what's called kanji, which is a Japanese version of Chinese characters. It is still logarithmic. I'm sorry, not logarithmic. It is still a symbol-related language, and it's not phonetic script, but it's becoming more and more Japanese to the point where there's a lot of kind of crossover reading-wise. It's almost like a Romance language. Some people who speak French can sort of kind of read Italian or sort of kind of read Spanish and have some inclination of what they're trying to say there, but they are by no means fluent in it. The other records that we have come from about 1/10% of the total population, the very elite of the elite. A perfect example of this is the pillow book, as highlighted in your book, by Sei Shogunan. Sei Shogunan is one of these elite female writers, and there were a lot of them at this point, that gives us an idea of what it was like to live in the upper circles of Japanese society. It's kind of if Paris Hilton had written a biography, and then 1,000 years from now, archaeologists find that and try to reconstruct American society from her biography. God help us all, right? But it does provide a snapshot of elite life and the level to which the aristocracy was disconnected from everyday life. See, in the Heian period, your station is derived from a combination of your birth, your fashion sense, your marriage, and a lot of the other cultural touchstones. And station matters everything. Knowing exactly how far above or how far below you are everybody else in the room will dictate how you behave, and will also dictate how everybody else interacts. You can imagine it's a very stiff kind of society, or a very stiff kind of interaction, but it's actually not, and there's a lot of flexibility there. Depends on friendships, depends on favoritism, political machinations, and that sort of thing. But understanding where you are in that society is exceedingly important. In fact, entire pillow books, entire diaries are devoted to figuring out who is on what level. The Heian continued to pick and choose from imperial China, and they they pick up fashion and they pick up ideas from China very piecemeal and very hand-me-down. As I mentioned before, they've already cut off formal contact, so the only contact that the Heian Japanese have is very informal contact through merchants or even less savory individuals, such as pirates or peasants, getting their information second or third or even fourth hand. And often this is really out of date. This is partly because the elite are really out of touch with even the people who live on the island. It's as if they try to make themselves into a kind of a society within a society, cloistered away from the rest of the world. So, as I mentioned before, the characters of Chinese are what are called Hanzi. It literally means the language of the Han, or the language of the Chinese, are logograms, not logarithms. Sorry, my bad. Logograms. They are initially based upon characters. And you can see that in the Hanzi character, the symbol for a human being can be turned into a stick person walking, for instance. Okay, and language morphs and added to and subtracted to over time. And that's where we get these Chinese characters that are borrowed into Japanese and become known as kanji. So here we have symbols for love in the Hanzi characters, and then the morphing into kanji characters. So left is Hanzi and right is kanji. The kanji literally means it's a kind of a Japanese attempt at pronouncing Chinese pronunciation, much like when the Russians refer to their king or their emperor as Tsar. It's actually a borrowing from Kaiser or Caesar. Same thing with the Germans. They spell it K-A-I-S-E-R, Kaiser, instead of Caesar. So we have this kind of morphing, and this becomes the language of administration. And by the time we get to the end of the Heian period, we have these kind of morphing and changing. You can almost kind of read together the two characters. You can see where the similarities are. Well, the hiragana script is vastly different, and it is much more casual, much less calligraphic, and it is based on the syllables that are common in the Japanese language. This casualness affords a level of comfort in writing these pillow books. So you get very personal, diary-like insights, even though some of these pillow books are actually published later on, especially if you're a particularly well-known socialite. And the characters develop into alphabets. It becomes unintelligible to non-speakers. Theoretically, the logograms can be intelligible to non-speakers with a little bit of coaxing and a little bit of training. You can kind of guess at what these symbols mean, but phonograms or consonant-vowel combinations become increasingly nonsensical to non-speakers. Okay, so what does that mean? Yeah, great, that's fantastic. I'm glad you took that left turn and took us down linguistic alley. But what it means is that the development of Chinese phonetic characters makes literacy far more accessible. Actually, literacy rates in Japan in this period become become higher and more prevalent than they do in China, from which a lot of these characters originated. So the proliferation of these characters allows for a more casual writing outside of the official records. You get the Tales of Genji, the Pillow Book are fantastic examples. Like Tales of Genji are fictional work. They're meant to titillate and excite. This is one of the earliest known novels that was intended to be a novel, intended to be a story, a fictional story, never meant to be taken literally, but yet nonetheless reflects some of the mores and ideas of the time. This courtly love, ideas of intrigue, of betrayal, of even supernatural occurrences. This is all part of the mythology or the social norms of the Heian period. And of course, the Pillow Book itself is also a kind of tell-all diary. But the Japanese phonetic alphabet also creates a sense of Japanese-ness to the writings. It's not a cultural borrowing from China. Can you imagine what that would mean for this new emerging society if it didn't have to borrow lock, stock, and barrel a language from another more dominant and theoretically being ignored power? It also sets up for divergent poetry, songs, and literature from the Chinese norms. A very good example, though much later and a little bit outside of our scope, is the development of haikus. Now that's a 17th, 18th century poetry, a kind of shortened poetry that comes from an earlier form of collective poetry that would have been about 13th century, 14th century. This collective poetry writing is part of a parlor game or an entertainment of elites that is part of Japanese society, not as much a part of Chinese society, which often reinforced this sense of connection with the past and honoring the traditions. And so the contemporaneous kind of spontaneous poetry was not as prized in China as it was in Japan. So the cleverness of the mind in Japanese society becomes highly prized. Okay, so what do we mean? Well, from the casual writings, we learn a lot of things about Heian Japanese culture. Well, one of the things, and probably the most striking, and as you saw, I'm sure your eye was drawn to the lady in the upper right-hand corner. Well, women had a very powerful position within the high-end Japanese society, particularly compared to their Chinese counterparts. It's not to say that Chinese women, say empress dowagers or concubines or whatever, or wives, didn't have at least some power in their husbands' say, but by and large, not nearly as much as Japanese, especially Japanese elite women did. They got involved in politics, and they interfered with politics quite a bit. They married for position as much as their husbands did. And of course, they tell us a lot about their styles. Not only the long hair, the exceedingly long hair, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, that woman's hair goes way the heck beyond her body, but also a white face and the blackening of teeth. Now, why were teeth blackened? Well, I don't honestly know for sure, but if I had to guess, I would say it's to differentiate yourself from the peasants who often had very simple diets, who often had very low sugar, low carbohydrate diets, often probably had much better teeth, maybe white teeth. But then again, I might be wrong. It might be just one of those stylistic things, like why do people like to put large gauge earrings into their ears or wear skinny jeans? It might just be a fad. The takeaway from all of this, though, is that the elite are increasingly disconnected from the everyday world. And as the writings go on, we see the more disconnected that you were probably the more higher ranked individuals. Rank, of course, is everything. So what does this mean in practical application for our history of non-elite people? Other than, these elite people really like to live basically behind closed doors and away from everybody else. Here's a good example of what I mean. They look like so many basket worms as they crowd together in their hideous clothes, leaving hardly an inch of space between themselves and me. I really felt like pushing them all over sideways. And this is a quote taken from your textbook, which also borrows it from the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. So this brings me to a question for you. What does this quote tell you of the distance between those who rule, the aristocracy, and of course, if we're talking about aristocracy, we also have to talk about the emperor himself, those who rule and those who are ruled. What are the layers of interaction? Are there people below your station that it's okay and maybe even pleasurable to interact with. Certainly, these people aren't interacting with fishmongers or rice farmers or merchants of the everyday ilk. So somebody has to interact on their behalf. Is it a 1 degree of separation? Is it 2, 3, 5, 10 degrees of separation? How long does it take for, say, some product created by a peasant to eventually make its way to the elite? How long does it take for an order from the elite to get down to the peasants? Well, as you'll read in your book, Buddhism, particularly Chinese style Buddhism, a very detached, esoteric Buddhism, really takes hold in the elite lifestyle. And this, combined with the attempt to move away and be disconnected from the everyday world, means that emperors began to retreat themselves. And you'll read about cloistered governments. You, of course, have to continue to administer your government, but you also want to live in a Buddhist monastery because you want to remove yourself from the world to show how elite and pure and, I guess, awesome that you are. But you still need to make things run, so your government comes with you into those monasteries. So a lot of these palaces are actually occupied by younger sons or heirs to be, and the emperor rules through his advisors, who then tell his son what decrees to make from the palace. It's a really convoluted and complex relationship for the government, which leads to a lot of inefficiency. So how does this sense of detachment from the government to the governed fit into this fashionable distaste for peasantry and real life? How do you think this might affect family life and the elite? By the 12th century, the golden age of Heian Japan is rapidly disintegrating. The Heian Japanese are increasingly inefficient in ruling their provinces. They become less interested in maintaining their manor holds and their control over the far-flung provinces, often preferring to stay in Kyoto itself. The emperor is decreasingly powerful, reliant more and more upon local warlords who can raise armies on his behalf, or even sometimes mercenaries. And so the result is that a lot of the administration of the government, as well as the products of the land, are really stagnant. There's no motivation for the improvement of the lot of peasants, for example, by paving roads or maintaining roads or dredging harbors or that sort of thing. That seems like work, and you don't want to be associated with the idea of work, because then it lowers your status. How dare you get down in the mud with the basket worm people, right? So you have this distance between the elites and the non-elites that eventually leads to a civil war. Actually, a series of civil wars that the clans in the eastern and western portion of the islands seek to kind of wring control from the super elite. Two such families are the Tiara and the Minamoto, families that initially are working towards similar ends and really undercut each other in that competition to reach the throne and become influential over the government, to kind of force the emperor into doing what that family says. Which brings us back to one of the earlier slides that we had several weeks ago. The emperor is becoming increasingly irrelevant in Japanese society. The dominant clan, in this case the Tiara, and then later on the Minamoto, they force the emperor to marry the clan's women. The emperor is then forced to abdicate after a male heir is born, and this undermines the legitimacy of the government. The Tiara, looking to basically establish themselves as the power behind the throne. The Minamoto later on decide that that's not the way to go, and they establish themselves as more of a military government that forces changes upon the emperor rather than trying to become like the emperor himself. This leads to the rise of a warrior caste system, the very familiar samurai caste that we discussed several weeks ago and that you may know from TV and film and novels as well. They embrace many of the Buddhist beliefs, but many of it is mixed with Shintoism. And the samurai culture remains influential in Japanese society well into the 20th century. For example, the Japanese military, as it took over islands in World War II and took over territories in World War II, often the officers carried with them samurai swords, and often they were authorities unto themselves, essentially behaving like samurai did. And even the samurai culture still kind of influences business practices and hierarchies in Japanese business today. So the Minamoto clan emerges as the rising power by the end of the civil wars in the 11th and 12th centuries. They establish essentially what's called the Kamakura shogunate. Unlike later shogunates, like say the oh darn, just a moment here. Unlike the later shogunates, which establish names or family names as the samurai shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate is named after the de facto capital city in the southern portion of the Honshu. And it lasts from about the 12th century to the 14th century. The elite in this period are not nearly as distant from non-elites as during the Heian period. There is still that stratification with everybody knowing their place and acting appropriately. For example, a samurai has the ability to mete punishment out upon peasants with relative impunity. Just going up and killing somebody for theft because he's a suspected thief or a suspected bandit, the samurai's word would be unquestioned, basically. So there is a little bit of distance, there is a bit of stratification, but there's not nearly the lack of interaction or that impetus to not interact with the non-elites. And in fact, you actually get an emergence of a meritocracy, especially in the military during this period. Later on, in much later, several centuries away, you'll even have peasants who are able to ascend the ranks and become samurai and become daimyo or warlords of the Japanese society. So this new elite is based upon not breeding per se and not education per se, although I put an asterisk next to that because the samurai caste increasingly becomes that. The caste is fixed, but in this period it's not quite there yet, so breeding and education is not as important as warrior status, or what can you bring to the table when it comes to war. The Kamakura shogunate also sees a difference in the way in which Buddhism and Shintoism really interact. During the Heian period, Shintoism was largely kind of a country religion, and Buddhism was more the religion of the elite. That changes under the Kamakura shogunate. They become complementary religions, and often Shintoism and Buddhism offer different levels of services depending on the life situation. For example, this connection to the spirit world and cleanliness that is part of Shintoism it works well with relinquishing worldly ties and ceremonies for dealing with the dead in Buddhism. So if corpses are unclean and Shintoism is really uncomfortable with dealing with death and has some very not very comforting ways of dealing with death, Buddhism steps in, and vice versa for Buddhism and Shintoism. Often marriages, for instance, take place in Shinto temples, while funerals often take place in Buddhist temples. The Kamakura shogunate really promotes the spread of Buddhism to the lower classes, and it leads to this fusion, increasingly, that samurai-like fusion of Shintoism and Buddhism. There's like 6 or 7 different interpretations, or what we call sects of Buddhism, that is propagated under the Kamakura shogunate. The divergent beliefs are part of what helps Shintoism and Buddhism to kind of have this happy marriage. A good example of this would be Buddhism offers salvation and hope during a time of war, during a time of pessimism, whereas Shintoism provides cultural ties to the past and this sense of endurance. So they are very complementary in many ways. Buddhist beliefs are adopted into a new warrior mentality as well as the socialization. This disconnect from ownership of the world, or disconnect even from the sense that that your life means something, or your life is beyond just fleeting, that it will somehow last forever, or that you will never get old. The Kamakura shogunate often rewarded its followers with lands, titles, and positions of honor. It was essentially a way to pay for the loyalty of your troops. For instance, during the Civil War, which was one of the big wars that caused the Kamakura shogunate to come into being, those who showed loyalty to the very rapidly winning Kamakura got some very prime real estate, or they got some very nice positions. And the shogun interjects himself into court life on top of that, so that he's able to ensure that these payments go out to those who are supporting him. Opponents often lost their lands, so there were always losers. There were people who were dispossessed of lands, dispossessed of titles. So you can imagine these poor white-faced, black-teeth women forced to beg on the roadside. Didn't really happen a lot, but I'm sure it happened occasionally. The shogun becomes the power behind the throne, does not try to become the emperor himself, does not try to conflate the two titles. The shogun is essentially the commander-in-chief, or the super general, if you will, of Japanese society, whereas the emperor is increasingly the spiritual symbol, and although technically has all the legal authority, the reality is that during the Kamakura shogunate, the shogun has to approve all of the decrees made by the emperor. So that's why the Kamakura period, the city of Kamakura becomes the de facto capital. They established dominance of the military over the civilian government and life. It's a very militaristic society based upon the needs of the military, not the needs of the elite. They established a little bit more clearer, more pragmatic, and more straightforward series of laws that are not based on Confucian philosophy, but upon military codes as well as local traditions. They also established this idea of a collective governance between the emperor and the shogun, this kind of partnership. Although the partnership is really kind of uneven, though the shogun may be considered, for lack of a better term, a quote-unquote silent partner. They don't offer themselves as the leader. He often defers in public to the emperor. The reality is the emperor is the one who determines very little. The shogun is the one who really holds the power. A lot of this is fairly good for Japanese society. The agricultural output increases, the population increases, there's more infrastructure built up, roads, tax collecting, harbors, all these sort of things. And there was even attempts to kind of reach out to China and to Korea, though very tentative. This changes a little bit and challenges the Kamakura shogunate when the Mongol Yuan dynasty is established in the 13th century. The Mongol Yuans, particularly Kublai Khan, sends emissaries to Japan and demands that Japan pay protection money, what's called what's called tribute to the Yuan dynasty. The Japanese claim that their emperor is descended from a sun goddess, that the islands themselves are very sacred to the gods, and that the Mongols' temerity will not be kowtowed to. And so they send away the emissaries and they prepare for invasion. And very well that they did. For only a few years later, a combined Mongol-Korean invasion happens in the northwestern portion of Japan. They bring along with them some of the more advanced military technology of the time, including fireworks and black powder cannons. And I know you're thinking fireworks, they're really pretty up in the sky, but is that really a military asset? Yes, it is. The loud booms scare horses, for example, and the shogun at this time and moving forward, they become increasingly horsebound knights, particularly horse archers and horse swordsmen. So they are dependent upon their horses behaving, and loud bangs with bright flashing lights often scared horses, which then unseated the Japanese warriors. Now, this invasion lasts for all of about a day when a very powerful typhoon washes over the island of Japan and destroys the majority of the Mongol fleet and army. Now, Kublai Khan recognized that this wasn't a failing on his general's part. It was just, sometimes the gods are angry with you, and sometimes accidents happen. It was basically a natural disaster that prevented this invasion. So he plans a second invasion for 7 years later. This time he has another army, a mixed Mongol-Chinese army, and they bring huge forces, overwhelming force, and the Japanese samurai are used to one-on-one combat to determine honor and determine position in battle. It's often very personal combat. The Mongols, on the other hand, are bringing massed formations, lots of firepower, lots of catapults and trebuchets and artillery weapons to destroy the enemy from a distance and just wreck him with absolute numbers. This seems to be a fairly successful campaign, although the Japanese had constructed a series of forts and walls along the seaboard. The Mongols were extremely hard to dislodge, and it took about 7 weeks before another turn of events, again another typhoon, destroys the Mongol invasion. And although this ends the last serious challenge to the Japanese islands for the next 500 or so years, it does instill in the Japanese a fear of Chinese invasion. It also sets up this idea that Japan is somehow divinely protected as well. The Shinto priests, for example, claim that the god of the winds had sent a divine wind, or kamikaze, to protect Japan, and therefore the Japanese are being protected by the power of the gods. Now, the shogunate had levied a really large army, and they had raised taxes in order to pay for the defense of Japan. Now, over the course of that decade or so, the extensive taxes, as well as the kind of overextension of the shogunate's army, leads to a lot of resentment and starts to unravel the Kamakura shogunate. Civil war breaks out in the 14th century as the emperor begins to defy and then eventually defeats the weakened Kamakura shogunate. This happens in the early 14th century. Now, the Kamakura had been dealing with some serious problems, particularly the rise of warlords who had expected rewards for their help in defeating the Yuan dynasty or the Yuan invasions and hadn't received them. And also a kind of internal political struggle between two branches of the royal family that had both wanted to ascend to the throne. Eventually, however, the Kamakura shogunate is undone They are defeated in 1333 and establishes a very short-lived, actually only about 6 years, of imperial rule before the imperial power itself is also replaced by a later shogunate.
So there are several things that you should keep in mind when we're talking about the shogunate and Japanese history in this period. This is a long stretch of time that we're covering, several centuries. In fact, there are many generations over the course of this 45-ish minute long lecture. We have to be very careful not to broad brush all of the shogunates with one uh, Japanese one-size-fits-all kind of explanation. The shogun ideals, for example, this idea of Bushido code, of living sparsely, of practicing martial arts, of living with integrity and honor and doing what you're supposed to do, are ideals. Just like chivalry is ideals. And just like chivalry, Bushido only applied to the very elite. Remember when we read that passage about how the elite saw the uh, hoi polloi, or the commoners, as basket worms? They really did see poor people as not really people, as different from. They were as distinct as you are from a cat or a tree frog or a bird in the sky. So these ideals are just that. And sometimes they've been romanticized, particularly in film and in literature, as being a more honorable, a more uh, understanding, a kinder society. That is absolutely not true. They are human beings, after all. And finally, the development of Japanese society was largely a reaction to outside forces, whether it was the altering of the capital or the altering of the letters that were used and the development of modern-ish Japanese script. And when at the end of the Kamakura shogunate, when the society started to become walled off, when it became illegal to travel abroad or for people from abroad to come to Japan, Japan began to stagnate. And when a society in general tries to wall itself off from the outside rather than adapting, they stifle, they ossify, and they crumble. So that is it. I want you to read chapter 13, The States and Culture in East Asia. And although I mostly focused on Japan, it will also look at some of the other states in Eastern Asia. I want you also to use these resources that I'm providing for you. Some of you have been going and looking for your own sources, and I would again urge caution using those. For example, Wikipedia can be edited by anybody, and sometimes factual errors are become entrenched in Wikipedia and are often changed back when they are kind of altered, or vice versa. Somebody can come in and change rather obscure articles which are not patrolled quite as much, and then you wind up with erroneous information. For example, for a while there, on the bio page of one of the cabinet members of Barack Obama, it said that this person was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and had criminal charges levied against them. This was absolutely false. It was not true. There was no evidence to that, and the attempt to change it through official channels, through protests from the White House, was stonewalled by Wikipedia because, of course, the White House can't alter its own website, even though there are, or its own information about itself, even though there is evidence to prove that the facts were wrong. So it took a long time for that information to be expunged. So do be careful with that. And finally, you should at least have started on Inferno. If not, let this serve as your notice. We are on week 12, and you are going to want to make sure that you read and ruminate, and that means to think uh, about Inferno, about the symbology that's used, about how the journey that Dante constructs informs his critique. How do the people further in the Inferno compare to the people in Canto 1? And in this case, I'm also not talking about just the beasts he encounters when he is about to enter Hell, which is Canto 1. It is part of Chapter 1, but we're looking for the first circle, not just the first chapter. We're looking for the first circle. He meets some people there. Who are they? Why are they there? How does their life in the afterlife in this circle of hell compare to those in other circles as well? And how does that tell us about his critique? And yes, this book was actually written in the 13th century, but only published or late 13th, early 14th century, and published in the 15th century. But the critique is still there. And so how can we interpret that critique in light of later critiques that come out about the people that he is skewering and sending to hell? That is it, guys. I hope you have a great week and see you again next week.